proactive about your objection handling versus reactive. You know the objections are coming. Why make it up every time?
This is Outside Sales Talk, the best podcast for outside salespeople. I'm your host, Steve Benson, and we're here to chat with the world's top sales experts so that you can get their best sales tactics to level up your game. Welcome back to Outside Sales Talk. I have John Barrows with us today, and he's going to teach us about proven techniques for crushing every stage of the sales process. Really looking forward to having you on the show, John.
Hey, Steve, thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it.
And by way of introduction, for just in case someone doesn't know John already, although he has been on the show before, right? So John
Yeah,
is
been a while.
a sales trainer and the founder of JBarrows Sales Training, which provides sales training and consulting services to companies and individuals worldwide. He has been named one of LinkedIn's top sales voices and is a contributor to Forbes and Salesforce. John is also the host of Make It Happen Mondays, which is a podcast where he shares his insights and advice on sales and business development. Well, first question, John. How do you identify and target the best buyer personas to ensure a high quality of meeting and also boost your sales opportunities? So early in the sales funnel, how do you kind of figure out who the optimal person is to target?
Yeah, so actually, it's funny. I'm playing around with a lot of tools these days that, from an AI standpoint, they can really help to hone in on that for people that don't really know, right? So if they're starting in new, you can actually take your website and put it into a couple of prompts and say, "Hey, tell me who my ideal customer profile is," and it's going to give you some really good results. But a more manual way to do it and a less automated, and I think it's important to understand is I think now it's incumbent upon all of us to reset on our ideal customer profile because what's been happening over the past 2 or 3 years, I think, has changed a lot, specifically since COVID, right? I mean, for instance, your ICP, ideal customer profile, might be the same, but who they sell to, like their ideal customer profile might be. And I'll give you an example. I used to mostly sell to SaaS companies, right? So, and I still do. But when the bottom fell out early in SaaS, like in the first quarter here, I started looking at who they sold to. And if SaaS sold to SaaS, so if it was a SaaS product that sold to a SaaS company, I ran away from them. But if it was a SaaS product that sold to an outside company, like to a non-SaaS audience, then I would focus on them because my audience is SaaS, so I know how to speak that language. But I wanted to make sure that they were viable, right? They were selling outsourced. And so that's why I started looking into that. So I think one of the things that you can do is you can go find the top 5 or 6 customers of your existing customers right now who are actually doing really, really well in this market, right? What do they look and dissect the hell out of them? And I mean at every level. Don't just look at the nuanced stuff like industry size, number of employees, and those type of things, the basic stuff that you can run off of any list. But try to gather the information about what's their tech stack look like, what stage of the business are they at, who do they sell to, who's the competition, right? All these different little nuanced pieces of that, so you can extract what the great looks like in today's market, and then go use that profiling information to go set up your systems in Sales Navigator or wherever it is to go find more people like that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And people so often go really broad with their ideal customer profile.
No,
They're like, "Oh, I sold to some medical device companies. So you know what's a good industry for me? It's medical
no,
device companies." It's like, well, but wait, was that a what kind of medical device company was that? Selling
exactly.
to what kind of doctor? Or is it different to sell to a dentist versus a med spa versus a heart surgeon? Oh yeah. And they so which one is it that is buying from you? And is there something about their product? Is it an expensive med device that costs $200,000, or is it one that costs $70 and is much?
Mhm.
There's all these little nuances that I think you really got to bucketize a lot tighter to figure out, or else you end up spinning your wheels and going after the entire med device world
Right.
of 8,000 companies.
And look, if you're in marketing, that's fine. Okay. If you're in marketing and you could send out mass blast emails, okay, I get that. Right. But if you're in sales, and especially like field sales and going out there, you need to know where to focus your time. I always tier out my accounts. I got my tier ones, tier twos, and tier threes, and they all have different characteristics. Tier ones are the great characteristics that fit that actual realized true ideal customer profile. And then my tier twos are good, but not great. And my tier threes are crap. And so by understanding all the details that are involved in making up those clients, now I can run lists, obviously, and start to approach them and be very thoughtful with my tier ones, but I can also gather that information along the way. For instance, our main goal of a cold call, right, is to get a meeting. But our secondary goal of a cold call should be to grab that one extra nugget of information. So I'll give you an example, right? If somebody is using SalesLoft as their CRM, that's a really good sign for me, right? Because 95% of my customers use Salesforce. They and I know how to work in Salesforce and everything from a CRM standpoint. So when you have that, that's fantastic for me. Now, if you're using like Microsoft Dynamics, that's good, shows you've invested in your team, but I don't have a ton of customers that work on that. And then if you're using like, a spreadsheet basically to manage your systems, that's not really my thing. So now if I call into you, say I'm calling into a VP of sales and the gatekeeper picks up and they say, no, she's in a meeting. Can I push it through to her voicemail? I'll say, yeah, sure, no problem. Hey, real quick, before I go through to her voicemail, do you guys use Salesforce? Oh, yeah, we do. Why do you ask? Oh, I'm just curious, right? And then I'll, leave my message and then I'll go into my database and I'll check off the box that says I use Salesforce. And eventually I can run a report that tells me everybody in my territory that fits this profile that uses Salesforce. And so my next call is going to be that much more tailored to that person because I've gathered that information.
Yeah, one thing I loved back when I was a sales rep was my whole world fit into a spreadsheet. And this is I'm dating myself. Well, I guess there were CRMs, but it was Siebel at the time,
Act and
and
gold
no,
mine and yeah,
yeah, no,
those ones.
and we didn't use it. We had it, but we didn't use it. But
Mhm.
it was I had a spreadsheet, and all the different columns that my goal was to kind of fill in all the
Yep.
information that I deemed valuable about these 500 customers that I
Right.
could go after, and it was that y- it's less visual in a CRM, but you do the same thing.
Yep.
You learn and you find out, and then you can start segmenting and sending the right emails, making the right cold calls,
Exactly.
figuring out where you can stir things up. What about personas? Once you've identified your ideal company profile, how do you identify the right person and look for your ideal customer at that company?
Yeah.
And how do you kind of adapt yourself in different industries and for different personas?
Totally. And look, I think there's a lot of different personas you sell to. It's no longer, that single person, that champion's going to get the deal done for you. You have to multi-thread. And so you have to understand who's the economic buyer, who's the technical buyer, who's the actual decision maker. So all those personas are really important. And I think it's our job, for instance, to really figure out, I wrote a blog post a while back called Sell to the 20%, right? Which is my fundamental belief that if you pick any product or service that you own, I guarantee you only use about 10 to 20% of the functionality of whatever that product or service is, right? I mean, Salesforce is a perfect example of that. LinkedIn's a perfect example of that. Like most people only use a fraction of what those things use. And so by understanding the fact that every client, every persona that you're talking to does not care about your entire solution. They only care about the part that's most relevant to them, that 20%. So our job is to be as relevant to those people as we can be and find that 20% and then almost create a Venn diagram map, right? Where I'm going to talk to the technical buyer, find the 20% that's most relevant to them, the economic buyer who's the most represent, the decision maker ultimately, and find that sweet spot where hopefully there's all alignment in that part of that 20% and then lean in on that. And how do I get to that? Well, it's about understanding what these people care about, right? It's amazing to me how sales reps still to this day walk into a situation and they say, so tell me about your business or how'd you get to where you are in your career today? It's like, it- to me, that those are two of the most disrespectful things that you can say to somebody. Because if you think about it, right, our most valuable asset's time. Okay. So the first thing you're going to do with my time that you just asked for is ask a dumbass question like that you could answer just by looking at LinkedIn for a few minutes, just by doing a simple Google search. Look, I've always been a priority based seller. I've always fundamentally understood, like when your CEO stood up in the beginning of the year, said, these are the things that we got to be to do to be effective, right? Then, uh, like if I can't tie my solution to one or two of those, good luck selling anything of significance, right? But the problem was I used to go in very uneducated and say dumb stuff like, tell me about your priorities, tell me about your business. Now, all you got to do is, again, this is a great application for tools like, well, not ChatGPT, but more like Bing or Bard or one of those that is more up to date on the internet. I mean, literally go in and say, I'm about to meet with a CEO of a sales training organization or a CFO of a financial services organization. Tell me what the top priorities of those people are in 2023 today as it relates to AI and some of the challenges. And you will see some fantastic stuff come back from you. Or do a simple Google search. CFOs, financial services, priorities, challenges 2023. Read a few articles. Go on Indeed or any of the job description sites and literally look at the job description of the person in the industry of who you're about to talk to. Not for that individual, but like CEOs in financial services. Look at the job descriptions of CEOs in financial services. Everything in there is a KPI that you can ask a question about. You can create a value proposition to, because it's not necessarily about being personalized these days, in my opinion. It's about being relevant. Because if you can't be relevant, I don't care if you know where I went to college. I don't care where you know, like if you know all the dumb stuff about me. But if you can't tie that back to relevance and how you can help me achieve my goals, I'm not going to pay attention to you. And if you don't know how to speak my language, I'm not gonna give you much credit or much additional insight. And I mean, think about the difference of the question of saying, "Hey, Steve, tell me about your priorities," versus, "Hey, Steve, I'm talking to other CEOs in these type of industries, and they're telling us right now their top priorities on their list are X, Y, and Z. Are those yours?" Even if it's not, you usually get a either a no but or a yes and people will actually be more open to giving you insights if you show you've done a little bit of work to understand what their role is all about. So that to me is you want to create profiles, ideally persona profiles within industries, because not all CIOs are the same, not all CFOs are the same, right? So CFOs in financial services have different priorities than CFOs in manufacturing. And if I understand what those are, I can ask better questions, come up with better messaging, and be more relevant in my conversations.
Such great advice. I feel like so many salespeople and marketing people reach out thinking they should be talking about features and,
Ugh.
who's the best company right now and why are you better than your competitor and, can they buy you coffee and, uh, all the little things. But what decision makers need is for a salesperson to reach out and say, I'm under the impression that this is one of your big problems.
Yep.
Here is how I can solve it for you in 2 sentences. Here is how we can make this problem go away and
Mhm.
link what you're doing to that problem. And that's where then you're a problem solver. Then they want if what you're saying is if you approach with the right problem, then they want to talk to you right off the bat.
Yeah. I'll give one more small piece of advice for people listening to this, and this is why I don't understand most companies don't do more of this, which is you have the exact going back to looking at your existing customers to understand your ICP. You have the personas that you go after, both in your own organization, by the way, and in your customers. So, for instance, if you're selling to CFOs and financial services, go talk to your customer success team and say, "Hey, can I get three existing customers who are CFOs in financial services? And can we just do like a 1 hour webinar or just like a 1 hour Q&A with them where my sales team gets to ask them questions about, what does keep them up at night? What does a day in a life look like? What were they doing before using our solution? And what are they doing, now? If somebody were to ask them, what value do we bring to them? Tell us in your words, not our marketing language words. Oh, and by the way, how do you like to be communicated with? Email, phone, cell? And when was the last time you ever responded to a prospecting anything? And could you give us an example of that? So you spend an hour talking to the exact people that you're about to go after, and then you create campaigns using that knowledge to those people, messaging and everything else. And then ideally you cycle it back to those people, be like, hey, based on what we learned from you, here's some messaging we created. What do you think about this? Have them give a thumbs up and then start executing. Because then you improve business acumen. You have messaging that should resonate really, really well. And oh, by the way, heaven forbid you actually get somebody on the phone to have a conversation with them, like a new prospect. You can pull from those stories. Hey, it's interesting you brought that up, Mr. Customer. We were just talking to three of our existing customers who are in that role and they were talking about da 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 da. Are you seeing the same stuff? Like that is such a more natural conversation than me memorizing some battle card about Susie and she's in marketing and she likes to be a CMO and creative. You know what I mean? And that those are useless to me.
Yeah, it's a really fortunate thing for a lot of field salespeople in particular. I think that they often have a similar customer that they're going after, a similar customer profile. And if they've been doing it for a while and they've been curious about it, they really become experts in a lot of these people's businesses. But
Absolutely.
half the time it's better, they know it better than they do, right? Because
Yep.
they're not, if you're selling a dentist, the dentist is an expert in fixing teeth, but
Yep.
they're not an expert in running a dental business necessarily. They
Nope.
whereas the sales rep has talked to 100 people that run dental businesses in the last 2 months, and so if you keep learning about their business and figure out who's good at what and why are they good at it, and kind of you can almost become an expert in their world, even though you know nothing about the teeth part. You can become an expert in the business part.
Exactly.
What are some techniques that you recommend, moving a little lower in the
Mhm.
stack? What are some techniques that you recommend that sales reps use to develop and deliver their sales pitches and their communications more successfully?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by a sales pitch, right? I mean, are we talking about the presentation of like after you've done all the discovery and now it's your turn to present like a demo? Or are we talking about like when somebody says, "All right, kid, tell me what you got. Like, give me your
Yeah,
pitch." Like,
I the second, not the first. I mean, it's always interesting to talk about what makes a great presentation, but I'm actually more interested in your take on how to in a more of a natural conversation.
right. And that's why like I actually fundamentally don't like the word pitch in any way, shape, or form, right? A cold call, like a pitch, just because what you're doing is you're pitching. That's inherently that's a one-way communicator, right? So I don't think anything should be a pitch. I think everything should be a conversation. And so I think a lot of it has to just do with, curiosity, right? And coming up with questions that prompt deeper discussion, right? There's a lot of sales 101 stuff as far as open ended, close ended questions, whatever. But I think one of the things that we really have missed, for instance, is talking about and understanding the real impact of what their situation is. And so I'll give you a quick example. People, a lot of us, myself included, were really good at reverse selling, right? So say you wanted something by August 1st. Well, if you want something by August 1st, if you want to go live date by August 1st, well, then it's going to take about 2 weeks to go through contract, 2 weeks to do this, and 2 weeks to do that. So if you want, August 1st live date, then we got to go, we got to sign this week, right? Most of us are pretty good at that. What I was terrible at, and I think most reps are too, is understanding the impact of if we don't go August 1st. Like, so asking, hey, just out of curiosity, what if we don't go live August 1st? And understanding, because there's really only two answers to that question. Like one is real impact of, something that'll happen to the business. And it's not just that they're going to miss out on the discount or anything like that. It's there's actual impact to the business. Or the other answer to that is pretty much anything other than that. Like, oh, we'll just keep doing what we're doing. And if you've done that, if you get that answer, you either A, not talking to the right person, or B, I wouldn't forecast that opportunity. Because what it means is you haven't done a good enough job in the discovery phase. And any pitch or presentation is rooted in the discovery phase. If you do not do, and by the way, I'm sorry, discovery isn't a phase. Discovery is something that happens throughout the entire sales process from the minute you start talking to them, every single conversation. But when it comes to your chance to quote unquote present your solution, it should be based on everything you've learned about the client. So technique is don't start your presentations with the 3 slides that every company starts with, which is the company background, the history, number of employees, and then the awards, right? Every company does that. It's like, oh, well, we were founded in blah, blah, blah. And look at all of our great logos and look at all the awards that we got. Nobody cares about that stuff. Right. They don't. I mean, if you think about these things, like there's some common truths out there from a psychology standpoint. One is I already talked about the most important asset any of us have is time, right? It takes seconds to get someone's or lose someone's attention these days. And the number one thing on the planet everybody loves talking about is themselves. And so you're telling me that you're going to come into my world and ask for my time, my most valuable asset. And in the first part of your presentation, you're going to talk all about you. You've already lost me. And so that's why it blows me away when reps like they do some decent discovery and they go through this really engaging conversation with the client to understand. And then when that's done, they go into presentation mode. And all of a sudden the slide deck comes up. And the sad thing about that is as soon as the sales rep goes into presentation mode, the client goes into presentation mode. They go from leaning in and having a conversation and being engaged to sitting back, crossing their arms and waiting for your pitch. and then you drone through a 30-minute demo presentation and you'd say dumb stuff throughout, like, "Oh, does that make sense? Does that make sense? Do you have any questions? Does that make sense?" And the client sits there and goes, "No, don't have any questions." And yeah, that makes sense. And at the end of one of our canned piece of crap demos, we always get that nice little parting gift from the client, which is, and by the way, if anybody ever hears this at the end of one of their demos, you know you've done a miserable job, and it's the word digest. You know what, John? I'm gonna need a little time to digest what you just told me right there. If you ever hear that, stop and apologize to the person that you just wasted their time. It's our job to help them digest the information. If they walk out of the conversation more confused than we're walking in, we've done a terrible job. And so the goal is to, first of all, if you're going to present, first of all, present, forget about your background. Ask, first of all, ask them, because your marketing department will probably kill you. Be like, "Hey, Steve, just out of curiosity, how much of our background do you really need to know at this point? Because I'd really rather focus on what's most important, which is you." Because sometimes there might be somebody in the meeting that's like, "Hey, I've never heard of you guys before. Give me, just give me the overview." Okay, cool. Then do that. But try to just move past as soon as possible. Then start with what you know about them. So here's what I understand so far based on our conversations. Here's your main challenges. Here's your main priorities. This is what the impact is, blah, 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 blah. Great. Well, look, as I go through my quote unquote pitch presentation, I'm going to be highlighting the areas where I think we can make the biggest difference, sell to the 20%, in those areas. Okay. And I'm just going to look for a little bit of feedback. And by the way, before we get into that, here's the quick agenda. And let me just go around the room real quick and understand what's the one thing you want to get out of this presentation. So, Steve, what's the one thing you want to get out of this presentation? Shelly, what's the one thing you want to, and you write all that stuff down. Then you start diving into the presentation. You kind of go through the stuff that's table stakes, be like, look, everybody has this. This isn't really what makes us special, but here's an area of our solution. Right. So now it's a conversation. And now you say, even if everybody else was spaced out through the entire conversation, Steve, you know what? You had said earlier that this is something that you thought was a high priority of yours, right? Well, here's the component of our solution that addresses that. And instead of saying, does that make sense? You say stuff like, could you give me an example of how that compares to what you're doing now? Or could you give me an example of how you see this fitting into your existing workflow? Because the way you explain to me how you see it fitting into your existing workflow or how it compares to how you're doing now tells me everything I need to know on whether or not it makes sense. And the last thing I'll say is bring that presentation down at least half the time. Do not leave your presentation up with your little small, especially if you're doing remotes, online sales like this. Don't leave your little bubble head in the top corner. Bring the whole presentation down so that you can gather their attention, and then bring it back up when appropriate. So that's how I would quote unquote pitch somebody, even though I never pitch anybody.
Yeah, it's the old using the period to make the presentation go black by tapping the
Mhm.
period button. Yeah,
Exactly.
that was Prezzo 101 20 years ago. I don't even know if
Yep.
that works in Google Slides. I don't think it
I don't
does.
know if it
I
does. Control B is on the Microsoft side of the house, but I don't. Yeah, I don't know Google Slides. But regardless, just take it off. Just stop your screen share or whatever it
yeah,
is, or put the
totally.
laptop down for crying out loud, right? But nobody
Yeah,
wants to be staring at those slides. Oh, and by the way, if you do keep those slides up there, they will stare at those slides, and they will
totally.
zone out, and they will not engage in the presentation.
It's a great way to bring it back. And I wish that you were around when I was starting my sales. Well, I guess you were around when I was starting my sales career, but you were probably you were in your sales career at the time too. But
Probably, yeah.
I wish that you had early on. I had managers that I would there was a I had an ongoing conflict with them that they wanted me to like stick to the slide and stick
Yeah.
to the script in these like in-person meetings. And I was like, yeah, you guys aren't in the meetings though. Like a lot of times they would like dial in and stuff, and afterwards they would be unhappy with me that I would kind of just have kind of a meandering conversation, not, I'd jump to this slide, jump to that slide, but it would be, a conversation talking about their
Yeah.
problems, and they were like, it works better if you just stick to the script. And I was like, you're not in the room. It
Mm,
doesn't. It
yeah, it
doesn't.
doesn't. Yeah.
I know it feels like you could just control this process, but really,
Oh,
but I love some of the tips that you had right there. How, asking how does this fit into your existing workflow? How do you see this being implemented in your
yeah.
existing organization? I think that's so powerful. It makes them visualize it. It makes them
Yeah.
say, well, and it uncovers the objections if there are any. Like, well, I mean, one problem is going to be, but it's very very powerful, very powerful. And I think it's not the right call to rely on the slides. I think you
Oh,
want to have
God,
the
no.
conversation.
I'll tell
So
you,
such
I
great
threw
stuff.
away my slides when I got that digest. No joke, because I was so proud of myself for crushing that presentation exactly how I should have done it, right? And I used to sell IT services with an engineer, and I would always go and do sales calls. And I vividly remember the day where I walked out of a meeting so proud. I was like, dude, I just crushed that. And I looked at my engineer, and these words literally came out of my mouth. I said, that dude didn't even know what to do with the information I put in front of him. And I remember my engineer, that non-sales guy, even he looked at me with this look like, "What did you just say?" And
Yeah.
that image of his look is just burned into the front of my retinas, and I was like, "Oh my god, wait a minute, what? He didn't even know what to do." Oh my god. I'm like, "What?" And that's the day I threw away my slide deck.
Yes, structuring your conversation based on their needs as opposed to how your training and marketing department believed the sales conversation should be structured is
Yep,
arguably one of the biggest changes you could make to be a more successful salesperson.
yep.
Um, so I've heard of your give a shit theory. How can professionals embrace the give a shit theory in their sales roles?
Yeah, I call it I always say that I live between the worlds of the give a shit factor and the unconscious confidence, right? I can't get you to care. I can't get you to want to be better, right? But once you do, oh man, I'll give you every tip, tool, and technique you can possibly imagine to get to the point where you actually don't need them anymore. And I remember this back when I was started my first company. I was the fourth person. I was running sales and marketing, and the 10th person we hired, super fired up. Right, 20th person we hired, super fired up. We got to around 50, and we just started hiring people that just didn't seem to have the same drive as we did, right? And it was inherently frustrating to me. I was like, "What the hell?" And I remember Jack Welsh, who I actually worked for Jack in later years. But when I before he came to Boston, and Jack, for people listening to this, if you're under 40 years old, you probably don't know who he is. Jack Welsh was the CEO of the century. He was the manager of the century, not decade, century. And he did a Q&A. And so he came to Boston. And I remember around that time, all his presentations are all Q&As, and he gets paid $250,000 to do a 2-hour Q&A, by the way, which is insane. But I remember asking him, I was like, Jack, you talk a lot about passion and all this other stuff. And, we're about 50 people, and it just feels like that 51st person that we're hiring just does not have the same, passion as we did. So how can I instill my passion on somebody else? And in front of about 2,000 people, he told me I was an idiot effectively. He goes, "You're looking at it all wrong." He goes, you can't teach passion. You can't teach that. You have to hire for that." And that moment changed my entire perspective on hiring, because I used to hire on skill, on background, on experience, and all this other stuff, right? But guess what? I can teach all of that. I can teach skill. I can teach how to go into a market. I can teach techniques. I can't teach drive. I can't teach passion. I can't teach the give a shit factor. And so that's what I hunt for these days. But to give a shit, I think the number one thing, personally, I think the number one thing you need to be successful in sales is a belief in what you sell. If you do not believe in what you're selling, you're just a douchebag sales rep trying to get a commission check. And I beg you to get out of this industry, or at least go find a product that you can believe in. Because once you believe it, and somebody told me this early in my career, and I still believe it to this day, that sales is the transfer of enthusiasm. Look, people still buy on emotion, they back it up with fact. I don't care where the data show, like it all still says the same thing. So if you believe in what you sell, that you're the right fit for not everybody, but for the right ideal customer profile, then it's just about finding those people and transferring that enthusiasm, right? And so that's where when I talk about give a shit, and another example I'll use here is I had an employee, this kid Morgan, who came and worked for me, right? And he was really good. He was an SDR and SDR manager, and we were doing prospecting. Like that's what his main job was, to sell and train prospecting. And so he did, right? And early on, we came up with cadences and contact strategies and messaging, and things were going pretty good. And we were getting pretty decent results. But then it just started to level off. And he was like, and he came to me and he goes, John, I'm struggling here. I feel like I'm doing all the right stuff, but yet I'm just still not seeing the results. And I said, Morgan, he's like, what do I got to do to improve my results? I said, Morgan, your results aren't going to change until one thing does. And he goes, what? I said, until you start giving a shit. And, and he looked at me kind of like, what do you mean by that? Right. And I was like, look, I know you give a shit about your job. I know you give a shit about this company and all that. But until you actually start caring about the person that you are reaching out to, and you look at them as more than a phone number, you look at them as more than just an email address, until you start giving a shit about them and stop treating them as a number or a cadence or a thing you have to hit, your results are never going to change. So give a shit. So here's an example. When I tell my reps when they come on board, they have to, we do an ideal customer profile. We get it down to their top 25, like based on demographic criteria, right? But then I tell them before you put them on your list, as far as your top 25, I want you to go find a reason why you personally want to work with that company. And that could be about their leadership. That could be about their mission. That could be about some of the cool things that they're doing from a social standpoint, whatever, or their product, that their products are really badass and you think is super cool. Because once you make that connection of, ooh, man, I really want to work with this client because I think A, we can make a huge difference, and B, I really align with their values, their mission, their whatever it is, then it's so much more natural to reach out to them with your messaging and your talk tracks and your questions and everything else. If you don't give a shit, you're just going to go through the motions and you're going to ask your dumbass bant questions. You're going to press play on your stupid ass demo and go through every single slide, and you're not going to engage, and the client's going to know it.
And sometimes they'll still buy, but way
Right.
less.
Right.
Way, way less. Sometimes all they needed was the information.
Right.
But the bad news is they could have found that out on the website. They needed the
Exactly.
passion. They needed to make this a top priority and be shown why this is a top priority, that they needed the passion of the person selling it, I think.
Exactly.
What about objections? Like, I guess I'm kind of creeping lower and lower in
Yep.
the stack here. How do you when you find out that a prospect is not immediately interested in a product or service, maybe they have objections, maybe they just don't seem that interested. How can, whether it's a, could be a price objection, could be a lot of things.
Mhm.
What do you what how do you try to get them to engage? What strategies do you use? How do you think about that situation?
Yeah, so I think there's two types of objections. There's objections with context and objections without context. So without context would be something like a cold call, right? Like where you call and you give them, your little 30-second pitch or whatever it is, and somebody's like, "Look, I'm not interested. I don't have any money. Like, call me back later, whatever it is." And then there's the with context where you've done discovery and you have some meat on that bone. So to talk about the without context, this is where I think it is important to understand the quote unquote techniques, right? Now, I used to roll my eyes at the techniques of like, oh, here we go, sales, old school sales, closing techniques and objection handling techniques, right? But what was interesting is when I took a training and I was exposed to the actual technique, right? I realized that I was using these techniques. I just didn't know that I was using them. And I was using them very reactively and quote unquote artistically, if you will. I was relying on my art form to know when and how and what to use whenever the objection came up. And so when I learned the techniques, I started to realize that I could use them far more strategically and far more proactively, and then started testing the different techniques. I mean, and anybody can do this right now. I mean, I train on this, but literally Google objection handling. Pick an objection that you're getting smoked on right now. Like we're not interested. You're too expensive. Whatever that is. Literally, and then legit Google it and say best objection handling technique to handle this objection. Or again, throw this into Chat GPT or whatever it is, and you'll find a whole bunch of different techniques from different people like me and everybody else on how to address that one. And so then what you do is you pick a couple that you feel comfortable with, and then you practice them. Somebody asked me, John, if you could go back and tell your 22-year-old self something, right? What would it be? My number one answer to that is A/B split test everything you do. And I mean everything, right? So, like, say you're calling CFOs and financial services. Well, come up with two different messages to CFOs and financial services. Make 20 phone calls with this approach, make 20 phone calls with that approach. If you got one email that can go out to 50 people, right? Because they all fit a very similar profile, fine, send it to 50, but break it up 25, 25, put it and just tweak the subject line. Objection handling. write down an objection that you're getting smoked on, come up with 2 different ways of handling it. Next 10 times it comes up, deal with it this way. Next 10 times, deal with it that way. Because Steve, your approach to handling objections is going to be different than mine because your personality is different. You know what I mean? Like I'm John Barrows from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm about as direct and in your face as it gets when it comes to selling. So I am comfortable calling you out on your bullshit. I am comfortable being very direct with you. Other people aren't. But that doesn't mean my approach is better than yours. It just means I figured it out for me. And so with all these techniques, you understand how to proactively use them and address them. And that's probably one of the biggest things I'll say is be proactive about your objection handling versus reactive. You know the objections are coming. Why make it up every time? Write down the top 10 objections that you get on a daily basis. Here's an exercise everybody can do is just take a piece of paper. Forget about dealing with the objections here for a minute. Just write them down. And when I say write them down, I mean word for word. Spend an entire week with a notebook next to your desk, say objections. And every single time you get off of a call, write down the objection that you got word for word. Don't, if they say budget, don't just write down budget objection. Write down, they said, we don't have any budget for this thing, or we don't have any budget, or we're on a budget freeze, or, we're spending money in other areas, right? Those are 4 different types of objections. So then once you come across the most frequent ones that you use, then you go find a couple of techniques and then you start practicing. And so that's without context, right? That's cold calling side of the house. With context, this is where you need to remind the client of what they told you. So one of my favorite techniques in general, and anybody can Google this, you just do JBarrows favorite nugget, is the summary email. So again, it goes back to discovery. First of all, you and I are going to have a real deep conversation about impact and everything else, right now. And then after we have this conversation, Steve, where you tell me about your priorities, your challenges, the impact, and all this other stuff, right? I'm going to document it. And this is the key to this. You have to let them know this is coming, by the way. You can't just send this to them and expect a response. You got to let them know. So at the end of a call, you go like this: Hey, Steve, thank you so much for your time, man. I appreciate it. Some next steps and action items here. Before I go ahead and do all that, though, what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly summarize what I was able to gain from our conversation today. Could you do me a favor and email me back to let me know if it's all accurate and if I missed anything? Right. So you tell them it's coming. And then right after you get off that phone, don't write a book here. Right. And this is not a chance for you to reiterate your value proposition. This is purely to confirm what you heard from them. Current situations, this, timelines, this, priorities of this, whatever. Right. Then you send it to them. First of all, the response to that's going to tell you a lot. I only get about a 20-25% response rate on that. But of the ones I get a response on, I have about a 90% close ratio with. Okay. Of the other 70-ish percent that I don't get a response on, I get about a 32% close ratio with. People above the power line, decision makers, have no problem responding to that email because A, lying is a waste of time. B, you just did their job for them, basically, right? They don't take notes, so you just did. People below the power line have a hard time responding to that summary email because they know their lives change so often that they don't want to commit to anything in writing. So right then and there, just by getting a response, that's gonna tell you a lot. Then objection handling. Then when the objection comes, right, whether it's sorry, John, we've gone in a different direction. Sorry, we're going to have to push this till Q3, whatever it is. Then you can actually leverage the summary email to say, hey, look, can we get back on the call here just so I can understand what happened here? Because I'm a little confused. Because previously you said your main priority is this, your timeline was this, and whatever it is. And it looks like that's changed. Can we just get back some time back on the calendar so I can understand what happens and see if there's an opportunity here, right? So that's kind of a generic way of doing it. Very tactically, the best way to do it is with video. Because when I would get objections, right? And this is a lot of times later on in the sales process where somebody's like, hey, you know what? Sorry. And it's almost always an email, right? If I get it face to face, I can talk about that too. But usually an email. And obviously you want to call them right away, but they're not going to pick up that phone, right? And what are you going to write in an email that actually is going to get them to change their mind? It's not. But if you do a video, with like you're using like a tool, whatever, and you do the little bubble screen where you pick up, you bring your summary email up on the screen and you put your little bubble head in the corner of a video and you're like, hey, Steve, I got your email. Look, I totally appreciate the fact that challenges, priorities change all the time, budget priorities change, all that stuff too. I'm a little confused though, and I'm a little just concerned, quite frankly, because you had said earlier that you confirmed that your main priorities were this and this, that, and the other thing, and now obviously it looks like things have changed. So would you mind just give me a few minutes back on a call here so we can just reset expectations and I can understand what's changed? And you do that in a very thoughtful, authentic, real way, and you send a video. I took my response rates from emails of basically 0% response rate on an objection to about a 10% response rate to have somebody give me a chance to at least talk to them again. Now, does that mean I win the deal? No, but at least I got the opportunity here. And the last thing I'll say on objection handling, especially with, if you just want to get super tactical, it's just to ask a question. There's some Gong data out there that talks about how they compare the best reps to average reps. And that when given an objection, the best reps answer the objection 53% of the time with a question. Average reps answer it 31% of the time with a question. So, as an absolute default, ask a question. Quick example: John, you guys are too expensive. Sorry. Compared to what? Compared to my direct competitors? Compared to doing nothing? Compared to missing your quota this quarter? Like, help me understand. And how do you look at cost? Do you look at it from like this investment for this dollar figure for this session? Or do you look at it as total cost of ownership throughout the year of what you should produce using this? Like, help me understand how you even look at budget and cost, because there's a lot of different variables to budget. But most reps get scared when they hear budget and they'll immediately default to a discount, right? So that's why asking questions, tell me, like, give me an example. What do you mean by that? Help me understand. Those are the best ways to handle objections tactically.
Help me understand. Very powerful words. Very, very
Mhm.
powerful. Oh, well, kind of bottom of the funnel, how can salespeople ensure that they're going to close the deal successfully? What can they do to, well, I guess it's hard to ensure, but what can they do to raise their close rates?
I mean, I'll say something that most people don't think about, which is have a big fat pipeline. That's why I think prospecting is one of the most important things that any sales rep can do. I don't care how far you get in your career. I don't care how senior you are. I never understood the mentality of somebody else, of a rep, complaining that they didn't hit their quota because their SDR, their BDR, or marketing didn't give them enough leads. Like, if I was a VP of sales and an AE or a field sales rep came into my office and told me that the reason that they didn't hit their number was because they didn't get enough leads from marketing, before that phrase got out of their mouth, I'd probably fire them. So that's why I think prospecting is one of the most critical things that all of us can do, because with a big fat pipeline, you put yourself in a position where you want the business, you don't need it. And when you want the business, you sell the right way. You ask the right questions. You close on their timeline, not yours, right? But when you need the business, you do some shady shit. You know what I mean? Like, you offer massive discounts, you go over their head because you're not at power. But when you want it, you act totally differently. So I think the biggest cure is a big fat pipeline. Now, tactically, you got to look at impact. You have to find impact, because if you don't find impact in your deal of what the true impact of inaction is, you're you have nothing to push on. Somebody asked me recently, John, how hard can you push? Say deals, say it's coming to the end of the month, end of the quarter, end of the year, right? How hard can you push to get a deal done? And my answer was, it is in direct proportion to how much it is in your best interest versus their best interest. If it is in their best interest, because if they don't do this, there's going to be some significant impact to their business, or they're going to lose out on stuff, or whatever it is, then you can and you should push as hard as you want. Okay. You should go over their head, because it's in their best interest if they're not doing this right. Now, if it's just in your best interest because you got to close the end of the month, end of the quarter, end of the year, you're just a jackass sales rep. Good luck. There's not a technique I'll even tell you to try to do that. Right. So I think it's hunting for impact. And once you really sort of solidify and agree on that impact in the discovery phase, keep reinforcing that throughout. Do you still see this as the impact? Is this still what's happening? Is this still the timeline? Are these still your priorities? Right. And then when it comes to close, you remind them all of all that stuff. Well, this is all the stuff that we talked about, going back to that summary email. And here's the impact of this. So, and then last but not least, if they say, here's one more super tactical thing you can do. If they say they're going to make a decision on Friday, say this: great. When do you want to schedule a brief call so I can get a yes or a no from you either way? I want to get a decision meeting on the calendar for Friday. I'm not going to just let you tell me that you're going to make a decision on Friday. I'm going to say great, and I'll let you know. It's okay to tell me no. That's why I'll say it. So, and I'm not asking. I'm being very assumptive, right? So when do you want to? I mean, I guess I am asking, but I'm being very assumptive. So when do you want to schedule a call on Friday? What time works for you, so I can get a yes or a no from you either way, letting you know it's 100% okay to tell me no. The people that agree to that decision call, I have like an again 90+% close ratio to. The people that don't, about a 25-30% close ratio for. Because if they're not going to agree to that, that means they're scared that they're not going to tell you yes, and therefore they don't want to talk. They don't want to actually have the conversation with you.
Or they're scared they're not gonna be able to have an answer by then
Yeah.
because it's actually someone else's decision to make.
Well,
It's
and that's actually another caveat I'll give. I'll say, look, so I can get a yes or no from you either way, and these words are important. This way, we don't have to play chase. Letting you know we're gonna play chase, whether you like it or not. And my job is to chase you. Your job isn't to avoid me. Okay, so eventually I'm gonna get through, and it's gonna be weird. And I'll even tell them, and look, if we need to reschedule, we can. But this way, it's on the calendar, and we don't have to play chase.
I
So with
love
those
it.
caveats of you can reschedule if you want to. I want a yes or a no from you either way, and this way we don't have to play chase. If you still don't agree to that, I don't think I probably don't have the deal.
Yeah, or at least you don't have the timeline that you want.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, I think the impact stuff you were talking about is so important. If you're if they can finish the sentence, "We lose this much per month by not having done this," and, that number is a meaningful number, the deal is closed. So if you can run your sales cycle so that they can answer that question and believe their own answer, then, you know, that's things close themselves if you can do that.
Can I give you a quick example of how I screwed this up? Right?
Absolutely.
I say hunt for the 20%, right? And I had a great conversation with this woman and about sales training and the needs and the challenges of the team and everything else. And I say, well, she's, well, give me some examples of how your negotiation training worked. And I was like, well, I'm happy to, but instead of giving you my pitch and droning through the entire value of it, can I ask, like, why negotiation training? Like, what's the real reason for this? Like, and she said, oh, our executives are just getting rip roaring pissed off that our reps are giving away way too many discounts. And so I jumped on that. I was like, "Oh, discounting. Oh, let me show you exactly how we address discounting." So out of all the stuff I could talk to you about my negotiating, let me show you how it impacts discounting, right? And I went along my merry way and I thought I nailed it, right? But what I didn't do was understand the real impact of that discount because I ended up losing that deal, right? And it wasn't for price. It was, somebody else did a better job selling it, obviously. But one of the things I should have asked was, "Oh, discounting is the issue? What's just out of curiosity, what's the average discount rate right now?" "Oh, 20%." "Oh, okay." And this was a huge company. So I said, "And what's the net new revenue target for, this year of net new revenue?" She says, "About 100,000,000." "Oh, so effectively, we're talking about a $20,000,000 problem right now? Is that what we're talking about?" Like, I don't have to do an ROI calculator to get to this is a $20,000,000 problem. And the difference in the type of sale of me telling you how I could impact discounting, yay, look at me, versus how I can stop $20,000,000, how I can give you money back on that $20,000,000 problem. That is a much better conversation for me to having than how I can show you how to stop discounting.
So true. So powerful. And it that's the lesson I think we want to take away from this.
Yeah.
Uh, Next section, sales in 60 seconds. Quick questions, quick answers. First
Yep.
question, what's your approach to providing constructive feedback to an underperforming sales rep?
Make it as objective as you possibly can. It's just like a performance review. If the rep is getting if they're being surprised in their performance review, then you're an asshole boss. They should know exactly what their challenges are and exactly what they're working on. So I try to make it as objective as I can and set weekly goals, daily goals, those type of things, so you can give them one-to-one feedback when they need it.
And what's a technique that you recommend for sales professionals to consistently find new business, uncover new opportunities?
A very tactical one would be to get really, really tight on your ideal customer profile and then set up those criteria in a tool like a Sales Navigator, LinkedIn Sales Navigator, and create a list so that anytime somebody gets added to that list, you get alerted. Right. So what's going to happen is if I'm going after VPs of sales in the SaaS industry under 100 million that use tools like Salesforce, SalesLoft, and Outreach and those type of things, if I set that list up on a tool like Sales Navigator, not only am I going to get a list, but then I'm going to get anytime somebody gets added to that list, right? Because LinkedIn updates all the time, I'm going to get new people to reach out to every time.
And they're going to be at a stage, in their job where they're open to new ideas because they just started something.
Yep. Or their company just, or they just moved into that position, right? Their company just moved into that position where they now fit a better profile for me or whatever. But yes, it's going to give you reasons to reach out to them. And that's what we're hunting for, is reasons to reach out to people.
Makes sense. And of all the sales stages, what stage of the process do you find that people struggle with the most?
I mean, prospecting without question, everybody's trying to figure out how to get, but there's so many different channels to, there's marketing and everything else. But I would say the one thing that has the biggest impact is discovery. I think that most reps are stuck in their methodology, if you will, BANT, MEDIC, whatever it is, and they go route through those and they just ask their quote unquote qualification questions. And I don't think enough reps know the difference between qualification and discovery. Qualification to me is a stage. You are qualifying to see if they fit a profile that you can sell to. Discovery happens throughout the entire sales process and has to be continuous. So that's why I think discovery is the most critical and the one that they struggle with the most, because they think it's a stage and it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can always uncover new things, and really that's the goal of things like objection handling, is that
Yep.
not just to handle the objection, but to discover if there's an objection behind the objection, or is there a root
Mhm.
cause? That curiosity is so important.
Exactly.
Um, I mean, you're one of these sales gurus in the world. What is the best sales advice that you've ever received, or that you love to give people?
I mean, I love the split testing, right? A/B split test everything you do. But I think at the end of the day, it's to, for me, I would say, is to understand your values. Values is something that is underappreciated, I think, but once people uncover them, they realize how much better it makes their life and their approach. And going back to like identifying your ideal customer profile and then finding the reason you personally want to talk with those, if you go through the values and the why exercise of what you're trying to accomplish, like why you do what you do and what are your core values, then you start looking for opportunities that align with those. And then the conversations become much more natural, if you will. But if you're doing stuff, if you're working for a company that doesn't represent your values, you're not going to be very successful. If you're selling a product that doesn't align with your values, you're not going to be very successful. There's so many different examples of why I think values are so critical, that I think everybody needs to go through that exercise and then just have a plan, right? Because if you don't have a plan, I used to, when I got interviewed, I remember early days, I used to think the question was stupid. Where do you want to be in 5 years? That type of dumb thing. Oh, I want to be a manager, right? Now I actually think it's a really important question to ask yourself, but I don't mean it for at the job that you're at right now. I mean personally. Like look out 5 years and say like what lifestyle do you want to be living? Right? I mean realistically, obviously we all want to be driving around on yachts and not working for anybody, but whatever. Realistically though, do you want a wife, partner, kids, house, like what does that look like? And then back into it, right? And figure out what type of money do you need to make to get that, and what kind of job therefore do you need to have to get that. Because I have reps coming to me all the time saying, hey John, I'm thinking about getting another job and moving to another role. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, what's your plan? Like, what do you mean? I go, what's your plan? Be like, where do you want to go, right? And a lot of them don't have answers. And I tell you right now, like, if I have a plan, I will do the shittiest job in a company. Like, I will literally clean the toilets. I will take out the trash if it's going to get me to that next step. That's going to get me to that next step, and so on, right? But if I don't have a plan, I'm like I said, I'll eat a shit sandwich, right? If it's going to get me to that next thing, right? But if I don't have a plan, I'm just going to look around for better tasting shit sandwiches, and they're all going to taste like shit. And so without a plan, you're just kind of stuck in that perpetual loop of just doing, and you're never really going to be that successful. But if you have a why, you understand your values, and you have a plan, you can really create a meaningful career and a meaningful lifestyle for yourself here in this profession.
Yeah, super valuable, super valuable advice. I mean, yeah, there's so many nuggets here. I'm going to try to summarize all the stuff you've taught us today, but this is going to be a hard one. So the market has shifted a lot recently, and it's a good time to take the time to reset your ICP, your ideal customer profile. Rethink that. To do this, start by looking at your top 5 customers that are doing really well right now and dissect it. What does their tech stack look like? Who do they sell to? What's unique about them? They're not just a med device company. They sell lasers to dentists that are in high end, right? It's very specific, right? The goal of a cold call is to get a meeting, but also you want to try to take that extra step and get little nuggets of information to better understand your market. So, find out what CRM they're using, for example. Find out some element that you have figured out creates a pattern that you can match to that makes you more successful. So you can then tailor your communication. Next time you reach out, you can know whether this is even it qualifies them a little bit, right? And this will make you this ability to personalize better and drill down into a more ideal customer profile makes you more relevant, which relevance is huge today, obviously, as we talked about. You want to understand that every persona doesn't care about your entire solution, right? They often only care about the part that's relevant to them, and often that's a relatively small part. You want to take the time to research what exactly this type of ideal customer profile cares about so that you can customize your approach when you work with them. You can check out AI tools and job descriptions and things like that to figure out what's relevant to the people you approach. But really, the best way is to talk to your best customers, talk to the people that are already using you, and understand them, figure out, get the information from them to plan your future approach with similar people. And and this is something that John just pounded this whole time. Discovery is something that happens throughout the entire sales process. So stay curious, stay interested, um, you know, and 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 keep discovering new things. Always find out the reason behind the reason. The most important asset that everybody has is time, and people love talking about themselves. So don't just launch into your pitch. Learn about them, understand them, make your interaction with your prospects and customers a conversation by talking about them. Ask a great tip that jumped out at me in the beginning of a presentation. Go around the room and ask, what's the one thing that you want to get out of this presentation? And write it down. And could you give me an example of how this compares to how you're doing it now? And, write it down. And at the end of the conversation, at least they've gotten the most important thing to them and you've uncovered it. You can make sure that you touch on that. And by nature, when you're shaping your conversation with someone like that, it makes it so you can't just drill through a presentation. You can't just drill through the slides. It's got to be a conversation if you're going to, customize it like that on the fly. Hiring tip from John: you can't teach the give a shit factor. The number one thing you need to be successful in sales is believing in what you sell and understanding who you sell to. So sales is the transfer of enthusiasm, and you want to uncover the deep reasons within yourself why you want to work with this client. It can't just be because I want the money in the commission that I get from it. You have to understand them and know, how am I helping them? Why do I care? Why do I want to do this? That passion, that enthusiasm comes across. Write down specific objections that you're hearing and research different objecting handling techniques to test out with those objections. Then you can A/B test, as John talked about, and figure out what the best way to actually handle them are. But there's lots of coaching out there on how to handle objections, and so you can find an answer for almost every objection that you're going to come across. You want to be proactive in about handling these common objections, and one of the secrets to handling objections is address them before they come up. So before they bring up pricing, if you know your price is high, bring up that your price is high and talk about why, show them how. um, and another tip that John had on objections is that the best reps overcome an objection with a question. So they go deeper, they drill down. During the process, make sure that you and your prospect connect the impact that your solution will have on them, and try to get a dollar value out of them. They should say, this is going to be worth this much to me. I lose or gain this much every month that I don't do this. If they answer that question, you're in a great spot.
Mhm.
At the end of the sales process, ask if you can get a decision meeting on the calendar to get a yes or a no and say, this way we don't have to play chase. Great little tip from John about how to make sure you get a real answer out of somebody. John, this has been just incredibly valuable for our listeners. Where can our listeners read more about your work? How do they reach out to you? What's the best way to engage more deeply with you?
Yeah, appreciate that. So, I mean, the easiest way is just go to the website because that has everything. That has all my social links and everything else. And you can also kind of see the backstory of why, go back to why and values. You can see mine and see if they align with yours, but it's jbarrows.com. So the letter J, BARROWS.com. And then you can, all the social channels. My handle on all the social channels is John M as in Michael Barrows. So that's Twitter, Instagram, everything else. LinkedIn, I put a ton of stuff on there. The only challenge with LinkedIn, and I know this sounds like a humble brag, but it's more annoying than anything else. I've hit the 30,000 limit when it comes to LinkedIn connections. So I can't accept any more connections, but you can follow me on LinkedIn with the little bell in the upper right hand corner. And you can also email me. It doesn't matter. I don't think the connection actually matters at this point these days. So, but yep, those are all the ways. And Instagram is actually the one that I'd give a ton of free content and training away on. So if anybody's looking for some like one-on-one tips or coaching, feel free to hit me up on Instagram, and I'll get you back there.
Well, thanks, John. And this has been just a fantastic episode of the Outside Sales Talk. If you work in field sales, you'll love Badger Maps. It's the number one route planner, helps you sell 20% more and drive 20% less. You can get a free trial at badgermapping.com today. If anyone can think of any other sales reps who would benefit from the things that John's taught us today, which is basically everyone needs to rehear and rehear the stuff that you talked about today. Um, Share the love, forward this episode on to them. John, I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, man.
Take care.